Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fifth year of the two-day Corporate Governance Summit, Gatekeepers of Governance, that seeks to bring stakeholders of sustainable corporate governance together on one platform to address issues that are topical and thought-provoking. There is no shortage of evidence in recent times that proves that firms fail if corporate governance is suboptimal. Excellence Enablers, under the stewardship of Mr. M. Damodaran, is a niche corporate governance advisory firm that attempts to demystify corporate governance and persuade corporates to do the right things at the right time, in the right manner, and for the right reasons. We are pleased with the overwhelming response we have received to the summit and welcome the many speakers who are with us today and will join us later as well, as also our enlightened audience. And we hope that over 2 days, several practical difficulties in governance will be articulated and in the expectation that they will be addressed by the appropriate authorities sooner rather than later. Let me begin by asking you all to join in welcoming our very special guests, and I request Mr. Damodaran to please present both of them with a bouquet of flowers. The chairman of the Mahindra Group and executive chairman of Mahindra & Mahindra, Mr. Anand Mahindra. The managing director and CEO of Kotak Mahindra Bank and its principal founder and promoter, Mr. Uday Kotak.
Thank you.
Our inaugural session, ladies and gentlemen, will examine whether form has overtaken substance in corporate governance. Is an increasingly prescriptive regime which leads to box ticking the antithesis of good corporate governance? Will it legitimize a lowest common denominator approach? But before we jump into that, let me call upon our main gatekeeper, Mr. M. Damodaran, an independent consultant and corporate advisor, mentor, and coach, who serves on the boards of several reputed companies and is chair and founder of Excellence Enablers, a corporate governance initiative that focuses on improvement of board performance and the training needs of directors and KMPs. He has formerly served the government in various capacities and has been chairman of SEBI, IDBI, and the Unit Trust of India. A former civil servant, he has also been Joint Secretary of the Banking Division of the Indian Ministry of Finance. May I request Mr. Damodaran to please make the opening remarks and also welcome our guests and speakers.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an extraordinary privilege to have all of you here with us today. I know that corporate governance is not the most exciting subject when there are several other exciting things happening in the world, but that doesn't take away from its importance. This is the fifth year in which we have put together this summit, which we've called the Gatekeepers of Governance. And we believe that all of you who are here in this hall are in your own fashion gatekeepers of governance. You are the people who are in the vanguard of the movement to clean up the corporate space and to ensure that there is justice, there is equity, there is fair play for all those who are a part of the corporate governance system, of the corporate system in India. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than having two gentlemen whose careers I have watched carefully, whom I've known, whom I've had the privilege of knowing for a long time, and who to me represent the finest value systems that you can see in corporate India. In their own way, without making too much of a noise about it, they have put in place the right systems, the right practices, the right processes to see that business is carried on in a manner consistent with the interest of all stakeholders. And I've had the opportunity to witness this at very close quarters. A human being appeals to me for only one reason. and that is, there is no disconnect between thought and word. There is no disconnect between word and deed. What you see is what you get. No pulling of punches. Tell it like it is, so long as public interest is served in the process. What I think enables this is the fact that both of them are greatly interested in sports. Mr. Anand Mahendra brought a rural sport called Kabaddi into urban drawing rooms, which was a great thing. I mean, I can't play Kabaddi to save my life. That's a different matter. But then I think it's a great game. It's an Indian game. It's something that we must celebrate, something that we must enjoy, something that we must encourage. And he did it in a manner in which a lot of India understood the game, appreciated the game, saw the energy and enthusiasm that went into the game. In some sense, representative of the aspirations of a country that is on the rise. But what he did next was what appealed to me. When he found that others that were with him in this endeavor were looking at it as a revenue stream and not as a method to popularize the game, he opted out and said, I've done what I needed to do. I brought this into the drawing rooms of metropolitan and urban India. Now let it run its course. Uday, as many of you know, started out as a cricket enthusiast, then decided instead of using his bat, he would stop the ball with his head. Went in for a slightly challenging surgical process, and then decided that corporate India needed him more in the cricket field, left that to lesser mortals, and he's now with us here. He's also, as you are aware, the one that has helped to construct the road on which regulation and law is traveling, and that's an effort that he continues to get associated with. Every time there is a committee that is formed, I think they look to him in order to provide the leadership. So we have both of them here. But what gives me even greater pleasure is the quality of our audience. I was asked yesterday by someone who saw the list of speakers for today and tomorrow. He said, how have you managed to put together such an impressive list of speakers? I said, you haven't seen our audience. If you think these speakers are good, you must see our audience. I mentioned this last time, and I say this again, that in this audience, I can pick out at least 20 people who could be here leading discussions in the subsequent sessions. That's the richness of our audience. Why is that important? Because I expect you to put questions to them as we go along, and also questions to those that will follow them in the subsequent sessions. Thank you once again for being here. The way we've structured this is that I will get started initially. I had thought that this would be a conversation between both of them and I would have a ringside seat. I was told nothing comes for free, and if you have to sit here, you might as well take part in the conversation. So I will start by putting a couple of questions to them, and then we will let it flow as it goes along. So let me get started. First to you, Anand. The peg on which we want to hang this entire conversation is what I have stated. Are there too many regulations? Are we getting too prescriptive? Are we telling everybody every morning, do this, do that, do the other, don't do this, don't do that? And in some sense, not allowing people to figure out what is right and wrong and to go on the process. Is life getting increasingly prescriptive in the corporate space?
First of all, thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for inviting me here. Is this on? Can you hear me?
It is.
And I want to thank you for that, not properly.
It's working. It's working. You just keep on speaking. Then increase the volume.
How about this? Is this better now? No.
The last row, can you hear him?
I had actually told them to keep the volume low. I was worried about what I was going to say, Mr. Damodaran. I will tell you.
It's a conspiracy
It's
of
a conspiracy
silence.
of silence. Anyway, I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction, first of all. Although I have to say I was a little concerned when you described us as people for whom there was very little disconnect between thought and word. And I was trying to imagine that could also describe the current president of the United States. So I'm not sure this is a compliment at all. But I usually try to make sure there's a relatively good disconnect, at least in time, between thought and word, so that I have time to think about it. And I'm giving myself that time, obviously, to answer your question. But this is it's a very interesting question to ask as to whether things are getting too prescriptive. There used to be that old saying during the License Raj that for every action, there's an equal and opposite government program, sort of a new Newtonian law, if you will. And sometimes you wake up and get that sense that are people forgetting that what you're trying to regulate is business? And one of the most articulate practitioners of business, a man called George Dorio, who virtually invented American venture capitalism, he used to say that, look, your job is not to eliminate risk. It's to eliminate unwarranted risk. And your job as a manager, in fact, is to assume risk, and the more risk you take, the more reward you get. So risk is a very, very integral element of the entire capitalist system. Sometimes I wake up and it's not the prescriptiveness, it's the sheer proliferation of regulations that almost seem to be designed to eliminate risk. And so I would only start this conversation by saying that the fine line we have to walk is to ensure that with everything we are doing, and I don't mind it being prescriptive, regulations are meant to be prescriptive, just a question of the plethora of regulations and how do we decide when we are getting to the point where we are creating bureaucrats and process followers and eliminating risk and therefore eliminating the very vital ingredient of what constitutes business enterprise. Forget India, I think we saw a drama play out recently in the US with Elon Musk. And it was prescriptive, it was something that reined him in. I think most people would agree that he needed to be reined in. I mean, smoking pot on a radio show and sort of talking policy after that does sound excessive. But Musk represents that vibrancy of capitalism, the vibrancy of vision, of taking risk. His entire persona is based on taking risk. So I think what I'd love to understand and have as a conversation with everybody here, how do you measure when the risk has been eliminated and therefore capitalism in a sense has been quelled as opposed to simply being regulated and curbed? That to me, I don't think we have an answer to yet.
Uday, you've been in the forefront of the effort to improve regulations, fill in regulatory gaps, address regulatory overlaps. Did you have a sense of discomfort being a corporate leader, being a very successful person in the commercial space? A sense of discomfort that this entire committee system, comprising a lot of people from different interest groups, was trying to create a kind of a narrow path in which you cannot tell people that take decisions, that take risks, as Anand said. From those that were following procedure, seeking safety in doing what several people have done before, not venturing to go where no man has gone before, because that is, I think, what leads to progress. Did you get a sense of discomfort when you led the committee?
First of all, I think my mic is making me sound less soft-spoken than Anand, which I am. I'm more soft-spoken than Anand, but the mic is giving the opposite message. So there must be a good reason for that, Anand. Mr. Damodar, I think I wanted to first start by something which I was told as a child by my grandfather. And he said that in life there are two kinds of rules: God-made rules and man-made rules. Never break the God-made rules. Be ready to question man-made rules. And this is the philosophy which I think is at the heart of the issue between form and substance. And what we are dealing with is a society which, with an intent to control or manage substance, has moved significantly in the direction of rules versus principles. And I think the reason for that is actually in the financial sector in particular. It goes back to the global financial crisis which happened in 2007-8. And if you look at the whole area of evolution of regulation and supervision pre-2008, it was on principles. And what we saw happen in the financial markets is a race to the bottom. And inevitably, a bank A versus bank B. Bank A, which followed principles, bank B, which said, let me push the envelope on principles. Bank A lost out, and you saw an inevitable race to the bottom, leading to the global financial crisis. So there has been a shift in the whole journey on regulation, more towards rule-based philosophy versus just the principle-based philosophy. And this is a fundamental shift we are seeing in the last decade or so in particular. If you go back to the UK, you had a FSA which was separated from the Bank of England, and the whole narrative pre-2008 was very different from what we are seeing today. And that brings us to the heart of the issue on letter versus spirit. What we are finding today in the world of regulation is that when one takes a view that let's follow the spirit and the letter is not clear, therefore you go with the spirit, you inevitably get a pushback. Hey, don't give me the spirit business. This is the rule. Have you followed it or not? And you get a slap back. Therefore, if you take a view based on spirit, you run into problem. Therefore, even if spirit is a question mark on a particular rule, you then say, listen, I have no ability to question spirit. Let me at least follow the rule. So we are living in this world which is going through this transition in a way from principles to rules, and there may be a spirit behind the letter, but people forget the spirit and the letter remains, and we have to deal with this. Having said that, I think in the world of corporate governance, the challenge which we face is measurement of the rules. And I will use a tennis analogy here. And I'll speak about it in the context of my own career. In the early days of my career, I was very comfortable hitting the ball on the line. Okay, which means it's still inside and valid, but hit the ball on the line and be open to hitting it on the line. I've now come to a view, make sure that you hit the ball inside the line. Because if it hits the line, then you have an umpire who decides whether it's outside or inside. And God forbid, if the umpire says it's outside, you are in deep trouble. Therefore, a fundamental philosophic change which I have moved towards is make sure that come what may, work towards following the rules, but hit the ball clearly inside the line and don't take the risk of even trying to hit on the line.
Can I ask him a question? Udai, you put a brilliant metaphor there, and it's related to what I was saying. Do you think that by hitting inside the line, you have, in a sense, taken less risk than you would have and maybe foregone certain opportunities to grow?
I wanted to supplement that, saying the increasing margin of safety as you get away from the line and more inside, is that leading to suboptimal results?
I think it's a debatable question, but the risks of the umpire saying you hit outside the line are much greater, including the reputational risks, than hitting inside the line. Therefore, when you're looking at risk, Anand, there is that reputational risk. And in a 24/7 media, you're first hung in the court of media well before you go out into the real world.
True, and unfortunately today, unlike John McEnroe, you can't beat up the umpire either.
You can't. You can't even abuse your racket, forget abusing your umpire. No, but again, it leads me to this question that, on the tennis court, yes, there is a risk if the umpire sees it as being outside the line. and you think that it was, and you can't go back to the McEnroe days. I suppose in the regulated environment of business, it's much worse, because it's not just the 1 point that you lose. I think there is reputation risk attached, there's all manner of things attached. Are you sensing that post 2008, and clearly that's a landmark, not just for the financial sector, but for the global economy. Post 2008, our regulators worldwide, in order to prove that they belong, that they're relevant, that what they do is legitimate, are pushing the envelope.
You're asking a regulated entity or an unregulated entity?
Both.
Okay, I think the regulators are also grappling with this, because for every good story, there are half a dozen stories which are a problem. And I can sort of relate to the current financial sector situation in India. And you sit back and ask the question, where does the system draw the line? And again, I'm more in the context of the financial sector. If you look at 6 layers of checks, including in the financial sector, the first layer, of course, is the management. The second layer is the board. The third layer is shareholders, particularly the institutional shareholders. Fourth layer is the auditors. Fifth layer for leveraged financial institutions is the rating agencies. And the sixth layer is the regulator and the supervisor. Now we are seeing a number of situations where in the world of markets where there are minority shareholders who have very little say otherwise, or even debt holders, these 6 layers of checks and balances need to be working. And we are finding situations where you question whether some or all of these layers are not doing their fiduciary job. And how do you work towards a situation where finally the blame comes on policymakers when all the 5 or 6 layers fail? So how do you deal with that and the reaction of the public where money is at risk? And it is a backlash, and then there's a societal backlash. There is very, social media has changed the parameters of B2B to B2C in the whole communication, and B2C with relatively limited understanding of the reality. You can see things getting out of control, and regulators therefore have had to meet this challenge of being responsible disproportionately as well.
So Damodaran, the reason I wanted you in the conversation rather than sitting out there is because you could come in very, very strongly on issues like this. You've been a regulator.
Yes.
I wanted to flip the question and ask you, because you've seen in the past, as Uday said, the failure of many of these layers, whether it was the rating agencies in 2008, recently also rating agencies in the case of IL&FS. So having been a regulator, what is your answer to your question? Do you think that they're overreaching right now?
I think let me step back a bit and address 2 other issues before I get to what you are raising. One is, how are regulators appointed? You find someone that is available who seems to be doing nothing much that somebody else cannot do, and therefore put him or her as a regulator. The regulator is not accountable directly to Parliament. You're accountable through a ministry which takes the flak if regulation goes wrong. Occasionally you appear before a parliamentary committee, and if you're sufficiently articulate, you can put across the worst of cases and keep looking at the clock and seeing that it's lunchtime. And there are friendly parliamentarians in the committees who have to take their diabetes shots in time before lunch, and therefore the meeting comes to an end. And, I've tried this successfully whenever difficult questions. When I'm making a confessional
now you
statement.
See why I asked him the question.
It is safe to make it 11 years after stepping out of SEBI. But to your question, why are regulators being increasingly prescriptive? Regulators always play black pieces. You don't have in the real world the policeman who runs ahead of the thief. You wait for something to go wrong and then respond. Unfortunately, instead of looking at the laws, the rules, the regulations available to you, your first instinct is to write a new regulation. thinking that no existing regulation addresses what is on hand. So you have a whole body of regulations, some of which is really in some sense restating what exists. And the example that I'm fond of giving is that whenever a murder takes place, nobody says amend the IPC. You go after the guy, collect evidence and try and hang him if possible. But when Satyam happened, even corporate India said we need to amend the laws. Satyam didn't need any amendment of the laws. The existing laws were good enough to deal with Satyam. My worry as somebody who spent 3 years in regulation and a little over 68 years outside of regulation is that regulators firstly should not have a disconnect with the regulated universe. I think anyone who has been regulated is a better candidate, other things being the same, for being a regulator, because you know where the shoe pinches. You know what is practicable, what is pragmatic, what needs to be done. You don't need a sledgehammer to go after a fly because people notice sledgehammers and say, this guy is very active. He's got the sledgehammer in his hand. You're only going after a fly, you don't need the sledgehammer. Regulators, I think, need to step back, look at regulatory impact assessment, which is critical. We all talk about it. Before you write a new regulation, look at what the impact is. Do you need this regulation? All regulation comes at a cost. It is the beneficiary of your regulation who picks up the tab at the end of the day. So you got to see the cost-benefit analysis for that person before you write a fresh regulation. I think the real problem is a philosophical problem, and I want to come back to both of you on this. I'll start with you, Anand. All of this is premised on distrust of business. You believe that if there were no regulations, no regulators, no laws governing this, the businessman will do something wrong in order to enrich himself unjustly. So that is the starting point, unfortunately, of all of this. So you set up the 6 layers that Uday spoke about in order to do this. Will we ever get to a situation where, to use a phrase from diplomacy, get to a situation of trust but verify instead of distrust and crucify? We are now in distrust and crucify. When will we move to trust but verify?
No, you're absolutely right. You put your finger on a problem that, to my mind, is not simply a corporate problem, but I think is a problem of mindset for Indian society. I grew up at a time, I'm sure we are of the same vintage, when there was this enormous mistrust of business, not simply by regulators or government, but by society in general. The names of the 3 largest industrial houses was synonymous with a kind of abuse. If you wanted to abuse somebody, you called him the name of one of those 3 industrialists. Or to call somebody a bania was in fact an insult in the old days. And then, of course, if you wanted people here wanted in the old days to get their daughter married to somebody from the IAS or IFS, never a businessman. Post the IT boom, that refreshingly seemed to change, and we started getting iconic heroes from business. And then, of course, liberalization came along, things improved. During the dot-com boom, suddenly everybody wanted their daughter to get married to somebody, or their son to get married to a woman who was creating a new unicorn. Unfortunately, not just in India, but even around the world, in the last few years, there have been spectacular business failures, and due to ethical reasons, which have, I think, set the clock back. So I don't have an answer to this. How do you change society? I think we need to be more vocal, Uday. I think as business, we need to put out there and showcase success stories where people have done business the right way. Recently, I think Uday's market cap overtook Maruti's, and I remember tweeting that, Uday, I'm very proud of you because you achieved it the right way. And I did that for that reason, because I don't think there are enough stories which are role models. We need to put out more of that, because really it's not about changing government perception. It's about societal perception, where in India we've slipped back. I think businessmen have come down a few notches. We need to work back on that, and then it's going to take time. There's no quick fix for this. But I do believe that there is this problem. If we can coming to a more granular level, my belief is that there has to be what somebody called a constructive sense of dissatisfaction between the executive and the board of independent shareholders. A constructive sense of dissatisfaction is not a constructive sense of distrust. I'm going out on a limb here. I can see two of my independent board directors here. I've got Ravi who decides my compensation as well, so I have to be extremely nice and positive to him. But, and Ravi, that doesn't mean you start giving me hell at the next board meeting. We'll have a chat about what a constructive sense of dissatisfaction means. But I certainly think it's not
providing protection from the back.
Absolutely, that's true. That's true. But I think constructive dissatisfaction as opposed to distrust is what at least we should try and engineer at the board level. The societal change will take a longer time.
In fact, I think I agree with Anand. I believe the society has gone the other way. It has become even more intrusive than the past. I was recently wanting to have a confidential discussion with a friend. So I asked him, why don't you come over to office? He said, I won't come over to your office because from your lobby upwards, there will be cameras. Okay. Now, why do we have that? It's back to the whole business about intrusion, privacy. We need to record everything. Something funny will happen. So we have created a mindset which has become significantly less trustful of the societal aspect. Same thing, how many of us feel comfortable talking freely on a mobile phone, and most of the time we switch over to WhatsApp? Why is that? There is something which is fundamentally changed in society. The informal contract of how we communicate, how we deal with each other has undergone a very significant structural change. And maybe digital age is responsible, a number of other factors are responsible. Maybe a liberal civil society is giving to the broader needs of the economy and the country, where a little bit of intrusion into what we called as a old-fashioned way of doing things is undergoing a fundamental change. And I think this is something which we have to ask ourselves, where do we want to be?
You know, staying with this question of distrust, and I know that here I am taking a huge risk, perhaps asking to be hit. One of the instrumentalities for ensuring that businessmen behaved was the institution of independent director. So you had a lot of people who supposedly were the good guys and girls who came into the boardroom, ensured that everyone else stayed on course, they stayed on course, asked the right questions, tried to enforce a kind of sense of justice among the various stakeholders. Over time, it's been found that in some cases, they were found to be sleeping on the job, or reportedly sleeping on the job. In some cases, they were awake, but didn't know what was happening around them because there was not even a nodding acquaintance of the domain. They were in the wrong boards for the wrong reasons. And therefore, some have described the institution of independent director, especially the subcomponent, the retired civil servants, and this is where I said I'm taking a risk, retired civil servants sitting on boards, saying that the only skill set that these guys seem to bring with them is the ability to open doors in Delhi. And I must share this with you, that I told someone that there are 5 listed entities on whose boards I sit, and the boards are chaired by Anand Mahindra, A.M. Nayak, Kiran Majumdar Shaw, and Pawan Munjal, and of course the chairman of S&P Global. I don't know who among them needs my help to open a door in Delhi or anywhere. If I needed help to open a door, I would perhaps reach out to these persons because they would know how to open doors better. Of course, I'm practicing on the door in the Mahindra boardroom, tough to open, but as some of you might know. So we have been equated to independent directors, some of us at least, have been equated to doormen. Of course, I draw consolation from the fact it's better to be a doorman than a doormat, because at least you're vertical, nobody is walking all over you. But do you find any justification in having this institution of independent director, attaching so much importance to it, having such great expectations from people who come in for board meetings and then disappear from there, only to surface again after 1 quarter?
I'm absolutely unequivocal about this, Mr. Damodharan. The value of independent directors cannot be overstated, in my opinion. And I speak from personal experience, and not because I'm cutting favor with the head of my nomination committee here. By the way, now you know why I'm here, how much I respect our independent directors and fear them, because he disclosed he's on my board. You said earlier one thing about, I think you were talking about regulators when you said they should be practitioners.
They should have been.
We should debate that at some time. I fear that if you get people who are business people to be regulators, they come with a lot of baggage. They come with their own biases. They come with their own failures. They come with experience of obstacles they had. And sometimes that leads to agendas, as opposed to somebody who has a little bit of a distance from it. I think you have to have somebody who's familiar with the field, who studied it, who at least is intelligent enough to be objective and has wide perspective. I'm not sure you want somebody who was a practitioner bringing the baggage of their experience. And independent directors, I find, frankly, there is value from a spectrum of people. But even those who are not business people, somebody who was in public policy had huge input in our board the other day talking about risk of getting into a country. We were getting into a country in Europe with political risk, and that person was very uncomfortable and brought a view about the leader of that country and the risks that it entailed, which frankly pushed us back a little bit rightfully. I'll be honest, I tend to be adventurous. I admit that, I confess that. I tend to want to take risk. I tend to want to step out on the track that hasn't been trodden on before. I recognize I need curbing. I recognize I need somebody to question and to challenge. And frankly, only independent directors do that. So you have to be willing to be challenged. You have to be willing to be curbed. But I don't see that as a negative, because I want to remain somebody who wants to take risk. And I don't want to be somebody who's so balanced internally that I turn out to be boring and don't take risks. I'd like to keep taking risks. I'd like to keep in our boards, Mr. Damodharan, looking for new things to do, and I want you to push back. So I actually think the institution of independent directors is probably the strongest keystone in the whole corporate governance landscape.
Is that a representative view, or is that your own view? I mean, when you look at the entire spectrum of
I would be the last person to be able to comment on that. It's all of you. Maybe the audience will be able to comment on that, because they've all been on boards.
Uday, one question staying with this. We are told, sometimes we read in the newspapers, that there are directors on bank boards that cannot read balance sheets.
I would like to add that there in some cases, and I'm not going to name them, there may even be managements who cannot read balance sheets. So
what do you think of this?
It could be a more universal issue. So, let me actually, taking on both the points and Anand's inputs, if we think about a board, there are 3 categories of directors who are on boards. One are full-time directors, who by very nature are non-independent. The second is non-executive directors, who may not be independent. And third is non-executive directors, independent. So a board would have some shape or form a combination of all these 3 categories. Now, if you look at, and I'm going back to first principles, the issue of the board versus management is, the role of management is to run and execute and come out with a whole business strategy and everything else, where the role of the board is to challenge it and govern it. So there are times when there could be potential issues between management position in their capacity as management versus the role as a board. So there is a fundamental risk of a conflict in that situation. So then that's the reason why you have non-executive directors. Technically under law, everybody has a fiduciary responsibility. So it's the same responsibility across the board. Then the non-executive directors, and to Anand's point of knowledge, ability to add different kinds of value would be in a non-executive director, whether independent or non-independent. Now, non-independent, again, is clearly linked to essentially some pecuniary or other relationship with the company which make them non-executive, non-independent. But they could be adding as much or more value in terms of their inputs from the point of view of knowledge and skill. But they need to be aware of their potential conflicts. So the institution of the independent director is created to essentially be aware of and protect the minority shareholder community, which has virtually no say, especially in Indian society today, from the potential conflicts coming out of, number one, management versus governance, and second is conflict of a non-executive director, non-independent versus independent. Therefore, in many ways, independent directors have the role of, number one, what Anand said, which is knowledge, skill, input, and second, like a check, that should there be a conflict, are the non-independents ensuring that the minority shareholder interests are taken care of. What we are seeing as an evolution is a dangerous, potentially coming from a regulatory mindset of creating an almost combative position between independents and non-independents, whether executive or not executive. So we have to keep in mind that even while we recognize the role of the independent director as an institution, we have to be careful we don't push it to a level where it is two sides of a battle zone. And that is where the regulatory framework has to be careful not pushing it above and over that edge. That's how I look at the situation.
You anticipated my question, so I want you to address this first because you've also been helping draft regulation, advising on what needs to happen. With this expectations from independent directors being heightened, almost every corporate failure you're looking for, what were the independent directors doing in the boardroom? With that kind of a thing happening, are you creating the opposition party in the boardroom that I will go into a boardroom as an independent director, determined to oppose or obstruct every management proposal in order to show that I was applying my mind, I was batting on behalf of the minority shareholder. Tomorrow somebody shouldn't tell me you were keeping quiet, having tea and biscuits while the management was, running away with the proposal. Therefore, independent directors gang up and become the opposition party in the boardroom. Is that a fear that you have as you make, as you have more penalties, make life more difficult for independent
I think that is clearly the risk. And we need to have a good answer for that. And since Satyam was discussed, if you recollect, and in many ways, Companies Act 2013 is often referred to as the Satyam law, because it is a new law which came on the back of Satyam. But the new law actually did one thing. It protected independent directors and gave more immunity for matters which have not come up to the board, which was not available earlier to an independent director. In fact, in Satyam, a lot of independent directors said, oh, this never came up to the board, how are we supposed to know? So the law actually has given greater protection for independent directors compared to non-independent directors post-2013. Therefore, if you take the spirit of that law, if they've been given more protection, by very logic, it should reduce the level of combativeness between the independents and non-independents, because there is a sense of better immunity for matters which have not come up to the board. However, the trouble is, moment you have a problem which is a potential fraud or a scam, the kind of public glare which is there today requires the regulator or the enforcement agencies to show some action. And this desire to, and it is about, again, back to a event sort of thing to show that the regulator is doing something, and which is leading to this friction, or potential friction, which can happen. I genuinely believe that we must give a lot more support to the regulators, because their job is extremely tough. It's all easy, relatively easy for us, but Mr. Damodaran, 11 years since you moved, I think the speed at which media and social media happening and the kind of accountability which is expected from the regulatory class for not having acted. And then you see this whole new trend which is also leading to extreme positions about the safest heaven in the world now being London. So how do you handle issues like that where you suddenly find that the best place to be in the world is London? So questions like that. So where do we draw, and why do, and it's a deeper society question, why do people not want to be prosecuted or actioned against in India? Because the belief is the law may not be fair. So then you get back deeper into society, which is leading to this opposite position.
No, regulators have one advantage, which is in the afterlife. When you have to go to heaven, or you're trying to get to heaven, there are two queues outside there. With the longer queue which says you have to first go to hell, qualify, and then come here. The other one is for regulators and vice chancellors, because they've seen hell already. So there is comfort. You need not feel very sorry for regulators. But just to shift track, auditors, the other great defenders. Sorry.
Could I make one comment on this combativeness?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Although it's difficult, after you made that last joke, it sounds like the requiem for this whole session. But I'll keep going. The combative nature that you talked about, Uday, I was wondering, this combativeness that you referred to, you're right, is become almost an axiomatic thing. People presume independent directors are watchdogs. So the questions they are asked are, what were you doing? As you said, were you sleeping when this happened? So the perception is they've been put there to create oversight over the non-independent directors and the executives. What about if we started saying, that's fine, they're there to challenge, to push back, but the ultimate goal of a board is to build the business. Why can't independent directors be held accountable for a business not working? And I'm not talking about failure, I'm not talking about fraud. I'm saying if a business is not performing, why should I only be held accountable? Why shouldn't Rajalakshmi, who's here, also be held accountable if Tech Mahindra doesn't live up to shareholder expectations? Independent directors completely go out of the line of fire when performance is being demanded or we are being held accountable. The moment we start saying, yes, they're there to challenge, but they're there to challenge constructively to help build a business, but we are going to hold them just as accountable if the company doesn't grow. That might suddenly bring people from one side of the table to the other and say, hey, you know, we're all in this together. Our first goal is to make this business grow. And the process of constructive dissatisfaction has one goal, not to check each other, but to make the business grow in the right way. If we can bring about that mindset, I think it would be very healthy.
I think, Mr. Damodaran, if I add to what Anand is saying, and this is one big debate which is not taking place in India, and which is a very different practice from globally, is skin in the game for independent directors. And globally, it is an accepted practice that independent directors can be eligible, including for ESOPs and stock options. I think Indian mindset has gone to a very different level, and I don't think it is easy to change it, where the feeling is that there will be collusiveness if things like this are allowed. And part of the combativeness is because I don't think the system and the macro system is ready to allow this alignment of interest between non-executive and independent directors versus so-called promoters and management.
But Uday, we had it, and a lot of our independent directors had ESOPs. Was that under the purview of your committee at all, or not?
No, in fact, I think it was pretty clear from a regulatory framework point of view that this is an area we should not be seriously treading on.
I think the parliamentary committee
I think it's under the Companies Act as well, isn't it? Independent directors are not allowed to.
They were persuaded that this will lead
and
to
this is back to Satyam.
That it will lead to short-termism, even though they forgot that there was a way to address this, which is that you don't trade in those stocks till you have left the board and maybe keep a cooling off period of a year or two after you leave. Then alone you can operate. Until then, you block it and keep it. And to the protection for independent directors, that section 149(12) doesn't travel far enough in my view. And the point that Anand made, which is a central point, everybody is responsible for business. In this big act, there is only one subsection which says that all directors are responsible for the interests of the company. You will not find any article in the media discussing that. I have written about it a couple of times, but no one has discussed the fact that, and you have very otherwise well-informed people saying that independent directors exist for the minority shareholders and that they don't have anything to do with the rest of the business, which is the wrong way to go. I wanted to spend a minute on auditors. Are auditors doing enough?
I see some of them in the audience as
No,
well.
there are very senior auditors here. Mr. Maligam himself will be here in the afternoon. So,
Anand, you go with this.
Anyone from KPMG here? Just checking before. We have been very fortunate in the Mahindra Group to have not only good firms as auditors over the years, from whenever I joined the company, but even in a continuing basis, it's not just the firm, but the individuals,
partners.
the partners, excuse me, who have been handling the Mahindra account have been exceptional individuals. So I think that's helped a lot, and I've learned a lot. I remember when I came back from business school, and it's interesting how I'm losing my voice when I'm talking about auditors here. But I actually learnt an enormous amount, Mr. Damodaran. I won't take his name now, but the person who was the partner at Mahindra and Mahindra, Ravi smiling, he knows who I'm referring to. I used to meet very often and in fact understand a lot of the arcane elements of accounting and auditing from that person. So when you have mutual respect with an auditor, as opposed to combativeness, I think it's a very, very potent combination. It's very powerful and it helps management tremendously. It educated me. It allowed me to understand what the room for discretion, what degrees of freedom we had in terms of accounting and our results. Of course, if an auditor comes in, as you said, initially with a distrust of that group or the person leading the board, that's a recipe for disaster. Or at least, if not disaster, it's not a recipe for constructive learning on both sides. As I said, I come from a circumstance that has been blessed. I think I see my colleague Bharat Doshi here. I think, Bharat, wouldn't you agree that that's something that we have been very fortunate that we've in fact learned from our auditors. We've never been combative with them. And so I'm a little, maybe I'm talking through rose-colored lenses here, but I'd love to hear what Uday feels.
No, I think I have to make the discussion interesting, so I'll take a different view. My view is one of the weakest links in the fiduciary chain of governance in India is accounting. And I'm not sort of talking about any specific auditors, but time and again we are finding that this situation is leading to significant issues for all listed, many listed companies, whether it's in the equity markets and or the debt markets. And the question you ask is, how do we really get to this fundamental conflict of interest, which I think is being addressed now by the government, between the auditing profession being under ICAI and also regulating itself. So there is an inherent conflict of interest which is now being addressed by the new body, which is NFRA, which is going to be an independent regulator of the accounting fraternity. And as the Prime Minister has said, the signature of the auditor is so important, especially for the entire body of markets and minority shareholders. Therefore, Anand's companies are a different breed and a different kettle, but as we in the financial sector deal with markets, and if we want to move much more market-based, we have to rely on that signature. And there have been time and again significant questions on the reliability of that signature.
When you mentioned conflict of interest, what were you referring to there?
Because ICAI is a body of accountants and is also the regulator of accountants, the same body.
Any trade body that is a regulator has an inherent conflict, whether it's a bar council, the medical council, whatever. time to bring in all of you. Three quick thoughts. One, please identify yourself. Please ask the question only after you have been recognized for asking the question. Secondly, make it only a question and not a detailed comment. And thirdly, indicate to whom you want to address the question. Who wants to go first? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vishal Javeri from Reliance Industries. My question is to respected Shri Uday Kotak. Sir, why do the international jurisdictions regulate corporate governance on a comply or explain principle? And the Indian regulator, which in its listing regulations provides that the principles will prevail over the prescription, regulates corporate governance through an SOP of fines.
So you are questioning that globally they're more principles oriented and India is becoming more rule oriented. Is that what your question is?
Yes, sir. Like when we read the international laws, the pretext is that if you fail to comply or if you partially comply with a particular prescription, then you provide an explanation, you disclose an explanation to the regulator and to the stakeholders.
I think it's a good question. Let me turn around with an answer, and I think there are explanations for that as well. Let's look at one of the new items under the Companies Act over the last 4 or 5 years, which is CSR, which is a comply or explain. And you have the government right now questioning, why is it that so many companies have not reached the requirements of comply or explain? And what is even more shocking is that there are a very large number of companies today which have zero CSR. And we are now at a situation where the government has put out a draft, as you are aware, to say that if you don't meet your 2%, the difference shall be put into a separate bank account to be paid over or to be adjusted over the next 3 years. We may agree or disagree with that, but the question is, at the time when the law was made, maybe corporate India should have worked much harder to ensure that what is coming in would meet the requirements. But after doing that, if comply or explain for a long period of time leads to potential non-compliance, what do we do? Of course, there's a counter argument from corporate India that a lot of money out of CSR, for example, is being misused under the name of CSR by companies washing the money out of these companies within the 2% bracket. That's the other side of the coin. Therefore, for moving to a more comply or explain regime, we need a much greater involvement of corporate sector, including industry associations, to then ensure that the philosophy of compliance is dramatically better. And I think I fundamentally agree with what you're saying, but it requires very high level of corporate behavior for us to get there.
I want to supplement that. When Corex was introduced, comply or explain, it was intended that the explanation would be to shareholders. Recently, the government has interpreted it as explaining it to the government, which makes nonsense of the comply or explain provision.
Yeah,
Leo, behind you, somebody first. After that, yeah. Thomas.
Morning, I'm Thomas Matthew, formerly of LIC. We had a lot of discussion about the independent directors. The data shows that from April 17 to June 18, more than 1,000 independent directors have resigned from various boards, maybe due to the potential risk and the higher accountability, etc. That might lead to a situation when we don't have talented people for the boards. That is one thing. Secondly, in the recent weeks, we have seen sudden resignations from some of the reputed boards. What's your comment? Is it right for the independent directors to flee the situation when the going is tough?
Mr. Matthew, the question was, is it right for the, sorry, can you just give the mic back to him for a minute?
Should they leave when the going gets tough?
In the recent few weeks, we have seen sudden resignations of independent directors from some of the leading boards. Is it right for the independent directors to flee the scene when the going seems to be tough?
When the going gets tough, the tough get going from the boardroom.
I know.
That's what he's saying.
He used to be on our board, and I don't think he fled. I think it was purely an LIC rotation, mercifully. But it's interesting, the situation is a difficult one here. Another colleague of mine on one of our board you're on, Mr. Damodaran, we were trying to get an international board member who's from a reputed business school. And he went through the whole process and talked to people, and then he just sent a mail a couple of days ago saying that when he talked around to other people with experience in India, he was told, do not ever take a board in India. It is not a wise decision. Just the regulations, the kind of legal jeopardy you will put yourself in does not merit it. And he actually sent us a mail saying, I'm sorry, I don't think we should do it. So something is wrong, Mr. Matthews. That person fled before he even decided to fight. And that's what worries me. I think we are cutting ourselves off from global talent. This is something I just recognized, as I said, only a week ago when this person mailed. So I don't blame people for fleeing. And we get into the whole area of conflict of independent directors, but really what's in it for them as well? You come in as a watchdog, you don't really get remunerated well. If there's a feeling of being accountable for and therefore also credited with the growth of a company, plus you're allowed to build your wealth along with the wealth of the company, provided it has some riders like the one you said that maybe you cash in afterwards. We are removing all incentives and we are removing all the credit for building a company. I really think it's a thankless job, unfortunately. We have to rectify this somehow.
Leo.
Actually, then I'll just follow up on that because I think it's a very important issue. It's not just independent directors. At the first sign of trouble, everybody leaves the room. Auditors leave the room, independent directors, chairman leave the room. And I think the problem is, what does this say about our corporate culture? Here we are, we're creating this whole architecture supposedly to protect investors and other stakeholders. And yet at the first sign of trouble, everybody disappears who are supposed to be the custodians. Now, Anand is being generous when he says you can't blame them, but we have to go a little deeper than that because it undermines the entire purpose of the entire exercise if precisely when you most need those people in the room, you need the wisdom. I'm not sure how it helps. Let's say a Jet Airways, if some of their best directors leave at that point in time, or a Yes Bank, or if a Mr. Bhargav leaves ILFS when there's a point of difficulty, that's when you need those people in the room. But it says something about the fundamental distrust that we've developed as a society, that the people need to feel, good people actually, need to feel the need to leave or are asked to leave or pushed out. So I'd like to just see, it needs a bit more exploration than simply saying, we understand why it happens because we are where we are. It's a very serious concern.
Yeah. They won't take that. Yeah.
So, I think we really need to think about it in 3 buckets. First is I genuinely believe that there has to be better alignment of interest. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is directors themselves should be doing a lot more diligence before joining the boards. Okay? And very often, I think directors themselves don't do enough homework before joining the boards. I think that's point number 2. And point number 3 is ongoing alertness on boards rather than just fleeing when trouble comes. So I think all the 3 points are important. Alignment of interest, better diligence before joining, and maybe, Mr. Damodaran, there is an opportunity for your firm to start a practice around diligence for potential independent directors with reference to the companies they're joining. I mean, that is something which will be very useful for people. And third is just be alert on the board rather than letting it carry on for many, many years, accepting it, and then saying, listen, why can I be held up? Because there is an accountability which is inevitable. So commercial part has been, my view is fair alignment, pre-due diligence, and ongoing alertness.
Interesting you say this because somebody asked my advice 3 months ago about a board, and I said, stay away. That person joined that board and is now wondering how to leave. But having just joined, it's not easy to leave. You need a fairly strong explanation for leaving. So there's not much of a practice that resides there, I can assure you. There's somebody from, yes, please. Yeah.
Hello. My question is to Sri Uday Kotak. I am Shripad Chende from Capital First. You mentioned about complying in letter versus complying in spirit. And many a times, especially for a regulated entity like yours, there is a dichotomy between which one to take. Heart says that you comply in spirit, whereas sometimes we tend to comply in letter. So what is right? So doing what is right or doing what seems right, according to you?
I think a very good question. Let me just step back. First of all, you should ask the deeper question. Whether the law under which you are being regulated is right in spirit or is it required in letter. So if the law under which you are required to comply with is effectively fundamentally against the spirit, and therefore you need to comply with the letter, comply with the letter. And that is how I would sort of say, and when you're complying with the letter, the second part of that is comply with the letter by hitting the ball inside the line. And make sure that there is no doubt about whether it is complying in letter or not. So don't have any vagueness with that. That's how I would think about it, because many, many laws in India, back to what we are discussing, had a meaning or a spirit at a point of time. The spirit is gone, the letter has remained. And that is the real issue. Therefore, you're then ticking the box. And if you're ticking the box, make sure you're ticking right inside the box. Don't hit the line and be fully within the box. That's all.
We have a cartoon outside on the letter and the spirit of the law. So when you step out, you can look at that. Last question. Right at the end. I see a hand right at the end. Please. Identify yourself. And to whom is your question addressed? Say that. Yeah.
My name is Radhika Haribhakti, and my question is to Uday Kotak. There was a talk on several points that directors, independent directors having a skin in the game by way of ESOPs or any other way is a good idea. But then we are really saying that the independent directors' interest is aligned to shareholders, whether majority or minority. And our job is to be aligned with the interest of all stakeholders. So would you not think that not having a skin in the game is actually making the independent director more independent and can take decisions or help the company take decisions which may not be in the interest of any of the shareholders, but in the interest of employees or community or environment or whatever other aspects we are held responsible for?
No, Radhika, I think it's a very good question. My view is alignment of interest. Now, alignment of interest can take very different forms, where Companies Act allows directors commissions. Now, commissions can be put on a criteria which could be a fair set of criteria, including broader stakeholder interest, in addition to shareholder interest. Therefore, you can define how alignment of interest is achieved and specify that. The challenge in India is that either independent directors are completely what I call as the Raja Praja model, which is they work like the Praja, and whatever Raja says they blindly follow, or they think they are in a battleground. What we need is alignment of interest with reference to a set of parameters which are stakeholder parameters. And we are seeing many, many cases where you define independent directors' commissions which are allowed under law on a set of criteria, it works. But we are also seeing extreme cases where promoters, and this is on very reputed boards, where the total directors' commission pot is, say, 100. The company announces 100 as payable to directors as commission. Okay? 99% of this commission is paid to the non-executive promoter chairman, and 1% is paid to the 7 other independent directors. And that is considered to be okay. So question is, how do you define alignment of interest is also extremely important for a truly well-governed board. And I'm not necessarily saying it should only be shareholders. It can be broader stakeholders in that definition, in how you divvy the cake.
Interestingly, in one of the AGMs, the shareholders raised this question. Why these poor independent directors are not getting a little more money,
in fact,
considering that
Mr. Damodaran, the amounts are
so
shocking. In this particular case, the commission pot was 25 crores.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know.
24.95 crores was
Family.
paid to the non-executive chair.
Family.
And 1 lakh each to 5 independent directors.
While
Actually-
I agree with you on what you just
Thank you.
said, just a comment.
I think we've had a good session. We could have kept going on and on, but
Just 1 minute. If you allow independent directors to have 2% stake in a listed company, depending on the market cap, you actually align the independent directors with the interest of the major shareholders. That's the concern I'm
No, I agree.
looking for.
At 2%, they will not remain independent either, no? If it is more than 2%.
Even at 2%, I mean, I'm just
I
saying.
think what we can do is to address this in the next Kotak committee, which I am sure must be round the corner, with so many suggestions having come up. Thank you very much. I think I have certainly enjoyed the discussion. Thank you once again to Anand and Uday. It's been great having both of them here. And thank you for continuing to be supporters of this movement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Damodaran, Mr. Mahindra, and Mr. Kotak. We'd like to present both of you with small tokens of appreciation, which Mr. Damodaran will do us the honor of opening and showing as well. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a very short break of just 10 minutes. There is tea and coffee outside, and then we return. We urge you to please come back in time to start our next session, which deals with winners and sinners and has Rajneesh Kumar, Sunil Mehta, and Pramit Javeri as panelists. Mr. Rajneesh Kumar, Mr. Sunil Mehta, and Mr. Javeri as panelists.